There is a letter that sits at the heart of this story. It was written in 1936 by a mother to her son. Not a furious letter, not a cold one. Something harder than both of those things. A letter from a woman who had given her entire life to duty, who understood better than almost anyone alive what it cost, and who could not comprehend how her own son had looked at that same duty and simply walked away from it. She wrote, "I do not think you have ever realized the shock which the attitude you took up caused your family and the whole nation." The son was Edward VIII, King of the United Kingdom, who had abdicated his throne after 11 months to marry a twice-divorced American woman named Wallis Simpson. The mother was Queen Mary, his mother, the woman who had stood beside his father for 43 years of marriage, who had endured 2 world wars, who had watched the monarchy come within reach of collapse and helped hold it together by sheer force of will and character. She never met Wallis Simpson. Not once. Not publicly, not privately. She refused until the day she died. History has not always been kind to Queen Mary. The Crown portrayed her as cold, rigid, a woman more married to the institution than to her own family. Her son Edward, in interviews after the abdication, described her with a bitterness that has coloured how people have seen her ever since. But the truth of Queen Mary is something altogether more complicated and more human than any of that. She was a woman who had grown up with nothing, who had lost her first fiancé 6 weeks after their engagement, who had married a king and stood beside him through everything the 20th century threw at them both. She was a woman who loved her children deeply and struggled to show it. And she was a woman who, when the moment of greatest crisis came, chose her country over her son and carried that choice and all it cost her until her last breath. This is her story. Victoria Mary of Teck was born on the 26th of May 1867 at Kensington Palace in London, in the very room, as it happened, where Queen Victoria herself had been born 48 years earlier. Queen Victoria came to visit the new baby and wrote that she was a very fine one, with pretty little features and a quantity of hair. It was, in almost every way, a promising beginning. The reality of Mary's childhood, however, was considerably more complicated. She was known in the family simply as May, after the month of her birth, and though she was a great-granddaughter of King George III, the branch of royalty she belonged to was very much the minor end. Her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, was a German nobleman whose parents' marriage had been morganatic, meaning he carried no real inheritance, no significant wealth, and a lesser royal style than his cousins. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was warm and generous and charitable to a fault that proved, in the most practical sense, rather expensive. The family lived well beyond their means. Her mother donated lavishly to dozens of charities, while the household sank steadily into debt. Before Mary's 16th birthday, the situation had become untenable. The family sold their valuables to meet their creditors and left England entirely, travelling through Europe and staying with various royal relations in order to economise. They lived for a time in Florence, Italy, where May spent her days in art galleries, churches and museums, developing the sharp eye for art and antiques that would define her for the rest of her life. During these years of itinerant economies, May served as her mother's unofficial secretary, organising, managing and keeping things running. She learned, from necessity, a particular kind of competence. She learned to function calmly under strain. She learned that feelings were one thing and duty was another, and that when the two conflicted, duty generally had to win. The family returned to London in 1885. May was 18. She was well-read, cultured, intelligent, and possessed of a seriousness that her contemporaries found striking. She was not showy or fashionable in the way that aristocratic society tended to value, but Queen Victoria noticed something in her: a strength of character, a reliability, a sense that here was a young woman who understood what it meant to hold things together when everything wanted to fall apart. She was not wrong. In November 1891, at a house party in Luton Hoo, Prince Albert Victor, known in the family as Eddie, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and second in line to the throne, proposed marriage to May. She accepted. Queen Victoria, who had long favoured May as a suitable candidate for the most eligible bachelor in the royal family, was delighted. The engagement was announced publicly. The wedding was planned. 6 weeks later, Albert Victor was dead. He contracted influenza during the pandemic that swept through Europe in the winter of 1891 to 1892, developed pneumonia, and died on the 14th of January 1892 at Sandringham. He was 28 years old. The country mourned. The royal family was devastated. And May, who had been engaged for barely 6 weeks to a man she had known only slightly, who had been preparing herself for a life as future Queen of England, was left with nothing. The wedding dress that had been commissioned was packed away. What happened next says everything about May's particular quality of character. She did not retreat into lengthy grief. She did not remove herself from the situation. She stayed close to the royal family, corresponding with Albert Victor's surviving brother George, sharing the particular intimacy of shared loss. George, who was now second in line to the throne and who had liked May for some time, grew closer to her through those months of mourning. The following year, on the 3rd of May 1893, they were alone together at his sister's house when George proposed. May accepted. They were married on the 6th of July 1893 at the Chapel Royal, St James's Palace. On the morning of their wedding, George accidentally caught sight of his fiancée down a long corridor of Buckingham Palace and made, as May later recalled, a low and courtly bow. She never forgot it. It was, against all expectations, a genuinely good marriage. George wrote to May every day they were apart. Unlike his father, Edward VII, who had maintained a succession of mistresses throughout his marriage, George never took one. He was faithful, devoted, and in his way deeply loving, though like May, he struggled to show it openly. They were, in the estimation of those who knew them well, two people who found it easier to express love through letters than through words spoken face to face. But the love was real. It sustained them through everything the century would bring. George and May had 6 children. Edward, born in 1894. Albert was born in 1895. Mary was born in 1897. Henry in 1900. George in 1902. And John, born in 1905, the youngest, and the one whose life would be the shortest and the most hidden. The children were raised, as was entirely conventional in upper-class families of the time, primarily by nannies. The first nanny was dismissed for insolence. The second proved far worse. Anxious to suggest that the children preferred her to anyone else, she would pinch Edward and Albert whenever they were about to be presented to their parents, so that they would begin crying and be quickly returned to her care. On discovery, she was immediately dismissed. But the damage of those early years, particularly for Edward and Albert, was not easily undone. Both boys grew up with complicated relationships with their parents, a distance that expressed itself differently in each of them, but that ran deep in both. Mary herself was not a cold mother. Those who knew her privately described a woman with genuine warmth, a sense of humour, and a real delight in her children's company. She taught them history and music. She took them to galleries and museums. She wrote them letters full of affection. But the formal conventions of her world, conventions she had been raised to respect and that she genuinely believed in, made open emotional expression difficult. The gap between what she felt and what she showed was real, and her children felt it, particularly the eldest. Prince John was in a category of his own. He suffered from epilepsy and possibly other conditions that in that era had no clear name. As he grew older and his seizures became more severe, he was moved to a small estate at Sandringham called Wood Farm, where he lived with his nanny and was kept largely out of the public eye. He was not hidden out of shame. He was kept comfortable, loved and cared for. But the world did not see him, and the world did not know him. He died in January 1919, aged 13, following a severe seizure. Mary wrote in her diary that evening that the news gave her a great shock, although she had for some time expected it. Then she went to her engagements. That single entry tells you almost everything about Queen Mary. The grief was real. The duty continued regardless. George became king on the 6th of May 1910, following a death of his father, Edward VII. Mary became queen consort. She was 42 years old, and she stepped into the role with a seriousness and a capability that immediately impressed even those who had underestimated her. She was not a natural public performer in the way that Alexandra, her mother-in-law, had been. Alexandra had moved through ballrooms and drawing rooms with an instinctive grace that seemed effortless because it was effortless. Mary's public presence was different, more formal, more controlled, more deliberate. She was described by many observers as stiff. What they were actually seeing was a woman who had learned from childhood that composure was the most reliable tool available to her, and who deployed it with the same consistency in public that she deployed it in private. The First World War tested that composure as nothing had before. George and Mary instituted food rationing at the palace, a gesture that was partly symbolic but also genuinely meant. Mary visited wounded servicemen in hospitals, an experience that caused her, by her own account, great emotional strain. She sat with dying men and held their hands, and came away from those visits shaken in ways she did not easily speak about. In 1917, with anti-German sentiment running at fever pitch across the country, the royal family changed its name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, a pragmatic and necessary decision, but one that required its own particular kind of loss, a severing from the German identity that had shaped Mary's family on both sides. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, George's health declined steadily. His lungs, damaged by years of heavy smoking, grew increasingly fragile. Mary attended to him with a devotion that those around them found deeply moving. She had always been his most trusted advisor on matters of state. As he grew weaker, she became, in many ways, the steadier of the two, the one who held the shape of the institution while he grew less able to do so. In 1935, they celebrated their Silver Jubilee, 25 years on the throne together. George, in his speech, paid public tribute to his wife with a sincerity and emotion that surprised those who thought they knew him. He had always struggled to say such things. That day, apparently, he found the words. He died on the 20th of January, 1936. His eldest son became King Edward VIII. And within 11 months, everything Mary had spent her life building came within reach of ruin. Edward, known in the family as David, had been a source of quiet anxiety for some time. George V, in his last years, had said of his eldest son with a bluntness that proved prophetic, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." He was not wrong, though it took 11. Edward VIII was charming, charismatic, and profoundly unsuited to the role he had been born for. He had known Wallis Simpson, an American socialite from Baltimore, since the early 1930s. Wallis was twice divorced. Her first marriage had ended in divorce. Her second marriage was still technically ongoing when Edward's feelings for her became serious. She was sharp, sophisticated, unconventional, and entirely unlike anyone who had previously moved through the orbit of the British royal family. Both George V and Queen Mary had met Wallis at Buckingham Palace in 1935. After that meeting, they refused to receive her. Mary's disapproval was rooted in something deeper than social convention. She had grown up watching the damage that inappropriate relationships could do to a dynasty. She had spent her life subordinating her own preferences to the requirements of the institution. She could not understand, she genuinely could not comprehend a man who looked at those same requirements and decided that his personal feelings mattered more. Edward VIII succeeded his father on the 20th of January 1936. Within weeks, the constitutional crisis that would define his reign was already taking shape behind closed doors. By November 1936, it was public knowledge that the king intended to marry Wallis Simpson, whose divorce from her second husband was not yet final. The British government, the leaders of the Dominions, and the Church of England all made clear that such a marriage was unacceptable. The king could not marry a twice-divorced woman and remain on the throne. Edward's response was to abdicate.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. And now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart.
During those terrible weeks of November and December 1936, while the crisis played out in private before exploding into public, Mary was in anguish. A friend wrote of her in November 1936 that she could neither sleep nor eat. Reports from those close to the court described her as on the verge of a nervous breakdown, having aged visibly in a matter of days, barely able to absorb the reality that everything she and George had devoted their lives to building was in danger of coming apart because their son would not choose duty over desire. She met with Edward. She made her position clear. She disapproved of the abdication absolutely. She could not understand it. She begged him, in the letter that has survived from that period, not at least to broadcast his abdication speech. "Surely you might spare yourself this strain and emotion." She wrote a plea that suggests not coldness, but a mother's instinct to protect, even in the middle of her own devastation. On the 10th of December 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His brother, Albert Bertie, the second son, the quiet one, the one nobody had prepared for this, became King George VI. Edward broadcast his farewell to the nation that evening, spoke of the woman he loved, and left England. He would not return to live there again. Mary wrote of the whole thing in a letter that it was too pathetic for words. Edward married Wallis Simpson in France on the 3rd of June 1937. Mary did not attend. She sent a telegram offering her best wishes. She was reportedly furious that Edward had chosen his father's birthday for the wedding, The 6th of June was George V's birthday, and considered the timing an act of thoughtlessness that bordered on deliberate provocation. Whether that was Edward's intention or simply his characteristic disregard for the feelings of others, Mary did not say publicly. She rarely said such things publicly. When Edward asked his mother to meet his new wife, she answered him in a letter. "I do not think you have ever realized the shock which the attitude you took up caused your family and the whole nation." It was not a refusal explained by coldness. It was a refusal explained by principle, the same principle that had governed every decision of her life. Wallis Simpson had been the instrument, willing or not, of the greatest constitutional crisis the British monarchy had faced in the 20th century. Mary could not receive her. The institution she had served and protected and devoted herself to for decades would not allow it. She never did. Not once. Not in the years that followed, not when Edward occasionally returned to England, not when he pressed the matter through intermediaries, not in the remaining 17 years of her life. The door remained closed. This is the part of Mary's story that has been used most often to argue for her coldness. And it is worth sitting with what it actually costs her. She loved Edward. That is not in question. It is evident in every letter she wrote to him throughout his childhood and young adulthood. In the anguish of those weeks in late 1936, in the careful way she maintained contact with him even after the breach. She loved him, and she could not forgive what he had done. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she carried both of them for the rest of her life. There is a particular kind of grief in loving someone and being unable to bridge the distance between you. Mary knew that grief intimately. She had known it before, in the gap between what she felt for her children and what she was able to show them, in the formal conventions that made warmth so hard to express even when it was genuinely felt. But this was of a different order. This was a distance she had chosen for reasons she believed in completely, and that she could not close without betraying everything else she had chosen to be. Mary threw herself into supporting George VI with the same unreserved dedication she had given his father. She attended his coronation, becoming, in doing so, the first British Dowager Queen to attend a successor's coronation. It was not a small act. It was a statement, deliberate and public, that she stood behind the institution regardless of the personal cost, that the monarchy was larger than any one of its members, including herself. During the Second World War, the king suggested she move to the country for safety. She did as he asked, going to live at Badminton House in Gloucestershire with her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort. She remained there for the duration of the war, as close to the conflict as she could manage, organising salvage drives for scrap metal, visiting troops and factories, maintaining the quality of engaged presence that had always been her particular contribution. The Duchess of Beaufort later recalled that Mary had been an exhausting and occasionally maddening houseguest who reorganised cupboards and insisted on helping with tasks that were entirely beneath her station, and who had also been, in her way, remarkable company. She spent her later years at Marlborough House, taking a close interest in the upbringing of her granddaughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, accompanying them to galleries and museums, as she had once accompanied her own children. She lived to see Elizabeth proclaimed Queen in February 1952, following the death of George VI from lung cancer. She outlasted 3 of her sons. She outlasted her husband by 17 years. She died on the 24th of March 1953 at Marlborough House, aged 85. The cause was recorded as gastric problems she had. In fact, she died of lung cancer. She had made one request about her death, that the coronation of Elizabeth II, planned for June, should not be interrupted or postponed on her account. It was not. The preparations continued while she lay in state at Westminster Hall, and the coronation took place 10 weeks after her death, exactly as planned. Duty, to the very end, and slightly beyond it. She was buried beside George V at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. She had been his wife for 43 years, his queen for 26 of them, and his most devoted supporter through everything the century had required of them both. She had also, in the end, been the woman who chose the crown over her own son, and who understood, more clearly than almost anyone, what that choice meant and what it cost. Queen Mary has been many things to history. A symbol of duty, a figure of coldness, a grandmother remembered for the formidable quality of her presence and the genuine warmth that occasionally broke through it. The woman who refused to receive Wallis Simpson. The woman who attended her son's coronation showed that the institution endured. All of those things are true. None of them is the whole truth. The whole truth is a woman who grew up in financial precariousness, who lost her first fiancé 6 weeks after her engagement, who married a man she had barely known and built something real and lasting with him over 4 decades, who raised 6 children in the compressed emotional register of her time and class, and loved them more than she easily showed. She sat with dying soldiers in the First World War and came away shaken, who watched her youngest son die at 13 and went to her engagements, who stood beside a king through everything the 20th century could devise, and then, when the institution she had devoted herself to came under the greatest threat of her lifetime, made the hardest possible choice and held it. Edward VIII said bitter things about his mother after she died. He spoke of her coldness, her inability to love in the way he needed. Those things may have been true from where he stood, but from where she stood, she had loved him as completely as she knew how, and he had left her with a choice between her love for him and everything else she had built her life around. She chose everything else. She never stopped loving him. She never forgave him either. That is not coldness. That is something much harder than coldness. It is the particular grief of a woman who understood exactly what she was losing and chose to lose it anyway, because she believed that duty was not a convenience, but a promise she had made at the beginning of her life and intended to keep until the end of it. She kept it. 10 weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter, Queen Mary died. The show went on exactly as she had wanted. It always did, with her. Queen Mary is one of those figures who tends to reveal herself slowly. The more you look at her life, the more you find beneath the formal surface. We hope this film has given you a sense of the full person behind the public image. A woman shaped by loss and duty, and a particular kind of love that expressed itself most clearly in what she was willing to sacrifice for it. If this story has moved you, please share it. And if you are not yet subscribed to History Roadshow, we would love to have you with us. There are more stories like this one coming. Thank you for watching.